The content in this video is for general educational use. It does not represent political opinions or judgments about any country, culture, or government. Information is based on publicly available sources and may be summarized or simplified. Viewers should verify details through multiple sources.
All right, so today we're diving into Chile. And you can't really talk about Chile today without talking about something that happened 50 years ago. An event whose ghosts, you could say, are still walking the halls of power, still shaping its present and its future. So let's get into it.
So, let's set the scene. It's October 2019 in Santiago, Chile, and suddenly the entire city just grinds to a halt. The streets, they're filled with this incredible sound of people banging pots and pans. A full-blown social revolution is unfolding right there on the streets. They called it the estallido social, the social outburst. And we're talking millions of people from every walk of life just flooding the city center in this massive outcry against the way things were.
Now, what's so wild about this is that for decades, Chile was seen as the poster child for success in Latin America. You know, it was supposed to be the stable one, the economic miracle. It was always held up as the exception to the rule in a pretty turbulent region. But that stability, turns out, it was pretty much a mirage. These protests just ripped the lid off, revealing a society that was absolutely at its breaking point, just simmering with decades of frustration. So you gotta ask, right? What happened? How did this model nation suddenly catch fire? Well, to understand that fire in 2019, you have to rewind the clock. We've got to go back, way back, half a century, to this single moment of trauma, a moment that Chile, as a country, has never really come to terms with. It's like a deep wound that just never properly healed. And that brings us to the event that changed everything. The military coup of September 11th, 1973. And look, this wasn't just some routine change of government, no. This was the violent, brutal end of a really unique democratic experiment. So here's how it went down. In 1970, a man named Salvador Allende, a dedicated socialist, actually wins the presidency in a totally free and fair election. But you can probably guess what happens next. The United States, absolutely terrified of having another Cuba on its hands, immediately starts this campaign of pressure, both economic and political, to destabilize his government. And that all comes to a head 3 years later, when the military, led by General Pinochet, literally storms the presidential palace. And the scale of this intervention, it was just staggering. A U.S. Senate investigation later found that the CIA spent $8 million, $8 million, between 1970 and 1973 just to fund opposition groups. I mean, that was an absolutely colossal amount of money back in the early 70s. And this wasn't just cash being thrown around randomly. Oh no. This was a really sophisticated, multi-pronged strategy. The CIA was funding opposition political parties and newspapers. They were planting propaganda to make it seem like economic collapse was inevitable. They even had CIA agents posing as journalists to shape the narrative. And then there was something called Track 2. This was a totally secret plan, completely separate from the State Department, with one goal: to directly organize a military takeover. And look, you don't have to take my word for it. The official U.S. Senate report on this, it was crystal clear. It concluded that American policy went from just supporting democratic forces to actively advocating and encouraging the overthrow of a democratically elected government. So yeah, this coup was not just an internal Chilean affair. So in the aftermath, General Pinochet takes over, and he rules for the next 17 years. And his dictatorship, it left behind this really strange, deeply contradictory legacy. It's almost like he created two completely different Chiles that were forced to exist side by side. Okay, so on one side, you have just brutal political repression. We're talking systematic torture, political executions, people being disappeared. Secret detention centers like Villa Grimaldi became infamous. But then, on the other side, you have this radical economic revolution. The government just unleashes these sweeping free market reforms, privatizing everything and completely reshaping the country's economy. This whole economic ideology, it has a name: neoliberalism. And at its core, it's a pretty simple idea. The free market knows best. The goal is to privatize, deregulate, and shrink the role of the government in the economy and in social services. You know, things like pensions, healthcare, and education.
So who came up with this plan? Well, they were a group of Chilean economists who got the nickname the Chicago Boys. Why? Because a lot of them were trained at the University of Chicago, studying under the famous economist Milton Friedman. For them, the coup was this golden opportunity. They came to the new military government with a fully formed plan to modernize Chile's economy. It became known as an economic shock treatment, and really, it's the kind of thing you could only pull off under a dictatorship. And this right here is the absolute key to understanding everything that follows. These two legacies, the brutal authoritarianism and the radical neoliberalism, they weren't separate things. They were fused together, welded into one. And then they were locked into place by a new constitution that Pinochet pushed through in 1980. It was basically a legal fortress designed to protect this economic model forever, long after he was gone. Okay, so let's fast forward to 1990. Pinochet is out, and Chile returns to democracy. And the whole world celebrates, right? But here's the catch. The transition was, well, it was flawed. It left behind a ton of unfinished business. Because even though Chile was a democracy again, it was a democracy stuck inside a cage built by the dictatorship. Pinochet's 1980 constitution remained. So sure, the generals were gone from the presidential palace, but their rules, their economic model, that was all still the law of the land. So for the next 30 years, Chile wrestled with this massive problem, what experts call transitional justice. I mean, think about it. How do you find the truth for the victims? How do you bring the perpetrators to justice? How do you build a shared memory of what happened and make sure it never ever happens again when the very rulebook for your country was written by the guys who did it? And for years, that constitution did exactly what it was designed to do. Politics was basically a sideshow to the economy. Any attempt to make big changes was just blocked. But the pressure was building under the surface. As this quote from 2014 puts it, the subjugation of politics by economics is being questioned. Basically, people were starting to say, hey, wait a minute. And that was setting the stage for the explosion that was about to happen. And boom, that brings us right back to where we started. To today. To this intense, deeply polarized fight over Chile's future, which, when you peel it all back, is really a fight over its past. And at the center of it all, you guessed it, that 1980 Constitution. You see, those 2019 protests, they weren't really about a hike in the subway fare. I mean, that was the spark for sure. But the fuel was 30 years of frustration with the inequality, the injustice, all of it baked right into the system Pinochet left behind. And the one central demand that brought everyone together was simple: get rid of his constitution. And incredibly, it worked. The protests forced a historic vote to finally write a new constitution. A mostly left-leaning group was elected to draft it. But when they put that new draft to the people in 2022, it failed. Big time. It was overwhelmingly rejected. 62% of Chileans voted no. So what happened next just perfectly shows how divided the country is. They decided to try again. But this time, the pendulum swung completely the other way. A new council was elected, and this one was dominated by the far right. They wrote a new draft that a lot of people thought was even more conservative than Pinochet's constitution. And in late 2023, the voters rejected that one too. So you have two tries, two spectacular failures from completely opposite sides of the political spectrum. So here we are. After all the protests, all the votes, all the years of passionate debate, Chile is right back where it started. It is still governed by the 1980 Constitution, a direct inheritance from the dictatorship. The ghost of 1973, it's still there. Which leaves us with one last, really tough question. The country is just stuck. It can't seem to agree on a path forward because it can't even agree on the story of its own past. So, can a nation this divided ever find a shared story, a common narrative that would allow it to finally close this chapter and start writing a new one? That really is the fundamental challenge facing Chile today.